Oh, you're here. Good. I was hoping for company. You see, I've got stories, dark ones, chilling ones, the kind that keep you up at night. Mythical creatures, curses, horrors you can't escape. Shall we begin? Don't worry, I won't bite. Much.
Have you ever felt a fear so deep that even though you were still breathing, your soul had already been hollowed out? I have. That day, I saw it. It used to be a person. It had a name, an identity, a past. But when it stood in front of me, it was no longer human. Its eyes were two empty black voids, its skin shriveled and tight against its skull, and its mouth stretched into a wide, blood-stained grin. It spoke, in a dry, rasping voice.
What are you afraid of? We are what you really are.
Then it smiled. At that moment, my world shattered. 1947, Komi Republic, Soviet Union, V-2 Biological Research Facility. It had no official name, no markings, not even a recorded existence. Hidden deep in the frozen forests, surrounded by endless tundra, it was a place where men like me worked in the shadows, conducting research we could never speak of. I am Vasily Markov, a neuroscientist at the Soviet State Biological Institute. My task was simple: to study the effects of extreme sleep deprivation on the human body and mind. This was an order from the highest level of command, a classified operation with no room for failure. The objective, to create soldiers who do not need sleep. We carefully selected 5 death row inmates. Sergei Vinogradov, 35, a former Soviet soldier sentenced to death for desertion. Anatoly Matveyev, 42, a political prisoner arrested for spreading anti-government propaganda. Pyotr Korolyov, 29, a convicted bank robber with multiple attempted murders. Mikhail Rubtsov, 25, accused of espionage for Britain. Georgy Antonov, 40, a serial killer, already sentenced to die, the worst of the worst. They were locked inside a sealed experimental chamber, equipped with beds, a toilet, basic food supplies, and a single ventilation system connecting them to the outside world. Through that ventilation system, we pumped a steady stream of experimental gas, N37, a modified stimulant designed to keep the brain in a state of perpetual wakefulness, suppressing sleep entirely. If successful, the Soviet military would gain an army of tireless soldiers. If it failed, we had no idea what would happen. At first, everything seemed normal. The subjects talked, laughed, even joked about their situation. But soon the changes started. On the first night, they were still having conversations. By the second night, they became irritable. By the third night, their eyes started to change. They stopped making eye contact. They began whispering, speaking in fragmented sentences. Some started mumbling to themselves, as if responding to voices we couldn't hear. By the 5th day, things turned disturbing. One of the inmates, Sergei, started clawing at the walls, tearing at the metal panels until his fingernails snapped off, leaving bloody streaks behind. He screamed at the camera, "They're watching us! They're watching us!" Pyotr sat in the corner, whispering to something unseen. "Who are you? Why are you hiding?" There was no one there. Mikhail, the alleged spy, sat by the air vent, pale as death, murmuring, "It's not just gas you're pumping in here." And Anatoly? He lay flat on the floor, tracing unknown symbols into the dust with his fingers. Physically, they were still healthy. Heart rates, blood pressure, brain activity, everything was within acceptable limits. But their minds had begun to crack open. We exchanged glances, all of us feeling it. Something was going terribly wrong. But the real nightmare hadn't even begun. Day 9, 3 a.m. The lab's alarm blared, yanking us from our restless sleep. Screams. The kind of screams that don't come from human lungs. High-pitched, raw, the sound of something being peeled alive. I ran to the monitors, my breath catching in my throat. Inside the chamber, Georgie was standing in the middle of the room, both hands shoved into his own abdomen. He was tearing himself open. His fingers dug into his stomach, peeling the flesh apart. His intestines slipped out onto the floor, coiling like wet ropes. But he wasn't in pain. He was smiling. Across the room, Pyotr crouched in the corner, gnawing at his own fingers, biting them off one by one, swallowing them whole. But the most horrifying ones were Anatoly and Sergei. They sat cross-legged, completely still, whispering to each other in a language we had never heard before. It wasn't Russian, it wasn't German, it wasn't any known human language. Their voices were deep, rhythmic, chanting, like some kind of ancient prayer. Who were they talking to? I gripped the edge of the desk, my fingers ice cold. Inside the control room, no one spoke. We all just stared. Then suddenly, Sergei turned his head, locking eyes with the camera. He was looking directly at us. And then, he smiled. In that moment, I realized we had opened a door that was never meant to be opened. Something had come in. Day 10. The tension in the lab was suffocating. Every scientist in that room, including myself, was now gripped by a fear none of us could rationalize. The test subjects were out of control, but they were still alive, still awake. They had stopped eating, stopped drinking, but their vitals, perfectly stable. If anything, they were even stronger than before. We reached a unanimous decision. The experiment had to be terminated. "We need to go in," said Viktor Ivanov, his voice barely above a whisper. No one wanted to, but we had no choice. Yevgeny, our lead psychologist, stepped toward the control panel, reaching to shut off the gas supply. And then, the emergency intercom clicked on. It was the commander. "Continue the experiment." His voice was calm, emotionless. "But," Yevgeny tried to protest, "this is not a suggestion, it's an order." The line went dead. The room fell into absolute silence. We were trapped. The subjects were locked inside their chamber, and we were locked inside our orders. Day 14. We had stopped arguing about stopping the experiment, because at this point we couldn't even convince ourselves anymore. The test subjects had changed completely. Their skin had started peeling, flaking off in dried layers. But they didn't bleed. Their eyes had turned completely black. No irises, no whites, just two endless voids staring into nothing. And their smiles had become frozen, like the skin on their faces had been stretched into a permanent, unnatural grin. They still hadn't slept. They weren't screaming anymore. They weren't talking to us. They were just sitting, staring at the cameras, waiting. That night, the last normal test subject died. Georgi collapsed onto the floor, his last expression frozen in a sick, wide grin. And the others? They didn't react. They just gathered around his corpse, standing in silence. The surveillance mic picked up a low, guttural hum. They were chanting again, calling for something. What the hell were they summoning? At midnight, the laughter began. All four of them, laughing in perfect unison. Deep, low, a single voice splitting into four bodies. Then they spoke, with one voice. "You are finally afraid." That voice, it did not belong to any of them. This was no longer science. This was something else. Day 20. We could no longer follow orders. We armed ourselves, tasers, sedatives, weapons, and entered the chamber with 5 Soviet soldiers. But we were already too late. As soon as we opened the doors, they were already standing, waiting for us. Their bodies were skeletal, their skin clinging to their bones like dry parchment. But they were alive, still awake. Their void-like eyes locked onto us, and before we could react, they attacked. Faster than any human should move. They ripped out a soldier's throat with their bare hands, snapping his spine like a twig. They tore into another's face, biting through flesh and bone. We fired, but they were faster than bullets. One of them caught a soldier's rifle mid-fire, turned it, and shoved the barrel into his mouth, pulling the trigger. Blood splattered the walls. The room stank of rot and metal. Yevgeny had collapsed to the floor, hyperventilating, trying to crawl toward the control panel. The gas! Shut down the gas! He smashed the emergency ventilation switch. The system roared to life, flushing the N-37 gas from the room. The test subjects screamed. For the first time in weeks, they showed pain. They clutched their heads, convulsing violently, like something was being pulled from their bodies. One of them staggered, staring at us, his mouth trembling, lips parting as if he was struggling to say something. "It doesn't want to leave." Then he collapsed. Their bodies hit the ground like empty husks, and finally, the laughter stopped. The experiment was terminated. The records were erased. Every witness was forced into silence. The facility was shut down. The bodies incinerated. The research classified. Whatever it was, we never found out. A virus? A mutation? Something beyond human understanding? No one knew. Years later, I left Soviet research, changed my name, moved to a remote town in Siberia, trying to forget. But it never left me. Some nights I still hear the laughter, and sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see black eyes staring back at me. It's still here. It never left.